All right, perfect. So first of all, thank you so much for making time to be here and talk with me today. I know it's hard to break away, you're very busy, so I appreciate you doing that. If you can just first tell me what is the Congressional District 1 seat and what are the responsibilities of that position?
Well, this seat, it's a representative position to Congress in Washington, D.C. And this seat is Albuquerque, all of Torrance County, parts of Valencia County, Meadow Lake, El Cerro Mission, and then Placitas and Bernalillo in Sandoval County. And so that's the seat. And the job of the member of Congress who holds this seat is to represent the people in the district in Washington, D.C. for all federal legislation. The other job that it has is to provide a constituent services office here in the district to help members of the district with any kinds of problems they have, whether they're immigration, whether they're not getting their Social Security check, what any problems that they have with the federal government. People should come to the office of the member of Congress and ask for help. And so those are the two. And then in Congress, it's basically trying to cover and represent the people in the district in passing federal legislation, in appropriations. And appropriations are really important because that's the money that we receive from the federal government to the state and to the district.
Very good. So if you can tell me a little bit about yourself and you know, what drove you to want to run for this position?
Well, I'm from New Mexico. I was born here in Albuquerque. I was raised in Los Chavez in Valencia County on a family farm. And I went to school in Los Lunas for grade school. I graduated from Belém High School. Then I went to University of New Mexico, undergraduate. One little story I always like to tell, because I think it says a lot about my persistence and my drive and my strength, is I formed the idea of going to law school when I was in high school and becoming a lawyer. So I told my high school counselor that I was interested in law. Mm-hmm. And he said, "That's great, Antoinette, because you're so smart. You'll make a great legal secretary." Now, there's nothing wrong with being a legal secretary. It's just not what I wanted to do.
Right.
And so I went to University of New Mexico, got my degree. Then I went to UCLA Law School. I then clerked for the D.C. Circuit in Washington, D.C., the federal district court. Mm-hmm. And then I came home, and I was privileged to be a law professor for 27 years. It was great. And then at the law school, we built clinics, because my passion is to serve the needs of community. So we built clinics that did that. We did a community lawyering clinic and an environmental law clinic. We did an innocence and justice project to fight the failures of the criminal justice system. It was great, and that was my passion, was to really work on I felt it was a state law school, and we had a responsibility to serve the needs of the people. And why I decided to do this? So 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to run a domestic violence agency, Enlace Comunitario. Mm-hmm. And we served everyone, of course, but our target outreach was Latino immigrants. So when this president was selected by the Electoral College, and that's how I like to say it, mm-hmm. selected by the Electoral College, I organized the domestic violence and the sexual assault agencies throughout the state to go to the New Mexico Supreme Court and ask the court to stop letting ICE detain people at the courthouse, mm-hmm. because of the fear it was causing our clients. Our clients were afraid to get the restraining orders they right. needed, or to even testify at the criminal or civil trials of their abusers. So that leadership was noticed, and people kept encouraging me to run for Congress. Mm-hmm. And one argument that I really, really took seriously, and that the argument that kind of pushed me to and made me decide, yes, I have to do this, was the argument that, and he was a former student, "Professor, we need your brains in Congress. We need somebody who has a deep understanding of the Constitution and someone who knows how government should work, mm-hmm. because we have a crisis in the White House." And that's the argument that made me think, you know, I'm going to step up and I'm going to do this. And I really felt it at the Women's March. Last year I was so depressed, and the Women's March gave me a glimmer of hope. Mm-hmm. This year, I couldn't believe it. I was on stage running for Congress, and I felt like, okay, I felt empowered, and I felt ready to do this.
So do you think, who do you, or how do you think, or how do you intend to stand up to Trump policies when you get there?
Well, one of the first things is, because I have such a deep understanding of the Constitution, is impeachment starts in the House. And the articles of impeachment are drafted by the House, and then the trial is in the Senate. And so I'm very eager to work on those articles of impeachment. One of the things is impeachment, as we all see, is a political issue. Not really a legal issue, but a political issue. And so we have to flip the House. And I really believe that there is a wave of blue candidates, especially a lot of women, who are going to go and really clean things up. And so one of the main things I think that is really important is to start impeachment proceedings. His record shows so much more than anything that President Clinton did. And I think that it's possible to really draft those articles of impeachment and render him as ineffective. And I think it would take a while, and I think that we can work really hard and diligently. I also think that I'm disappointed right now with Congress, because there's not enough Democrats to stand up and defend the Constitution that they swore to defend. And Republicans are either complicit or they're quitting. And so I know that I can stand up very strong and firm for the Constitution. I've never seen a president or heard of a president like this that just pretends there is no Constitution.
Right. So do you have allies in Congress already, or who do you intend to work with when you get there?
Well, one of the first, the first member of Congress to endorse me was Jamie Raskin. And he is a former law professor from American University. And he endorsed me, and we've had some great conversations. And he was a first, very early, he got on the Judiciary Committee because of his law professor credentials. And he shared with me that I should try to do the same thing, and I definitely am.
Wonderful. So I want to ask you.
I should tell you, I do have other members. I have Raul Grijalva, oh gosh, Lucy, I'm losing my mind. Linda Sanchez, Lucille, Roybal Allard. This is embarrassing. I've gotten anyways, but I do feel like
I know it's an on the whim interview.
Yeah, no, and it's also an honor that members of Congress, because this happened last fall. I got to meet with them, and they decided to endorse me, and I think that that's just such an honor to see that a member of Congress already sees the leadership and potential in me.
Yeah, I think you know, and the reason for that question, and it actually came from my community of people, were curious about that question because a lot of people didn't know before, you know, this race really who you were and how aligned you were to be able to build political power, because, you know, in community organizing, we organize for power.
Right, and you do power mapping.
And so we want to make sure that when we're supporting a candidate, that we are supporting a candidate who maybe you don't have all those connections already, but also being aware of what those connections are, and you know, who you feel like you could mentor under as a new congresswoman, and you know, how do you intend to start to build power once you get there as the new kid on the block. And so I think that those are important things for us to want to understand and be able to put our confidence in you, to know that you have the capability to go out and be able to do that.
Well, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus is a very important caucus and a very powerful one. And of course, I'll be a member of that. And also the Progressive Caucus is a very strong caucus, and I will be a member of that caucus as well. And so those two caucuses, I think, are crucial to helping us pass the progressive agenda that we're going to need to fix this country after the disaster that Trump is making. And so those caucuses are important. And when I've always, I understand what you say about power mapping, because I was able to build clinics at the law school. And as you know, UNM politics can be challenging, and I was able to do that. And I'm very strong. I was the first Latina to get tenure at the University of New Mexico Law School. but I wasn't, thank you, but I wasn't the last. And I mean, that was what was important. Being first isn't what's important. What's important is what comes and what you're able to do afterwards. And I was very instrumental in ensuring that our faculty at one point was one of the most diverse faculties in the country.
I appreciate that very much. Can you tell me about what are your top 3 priorities if you're elected to this?
Well, one, I really think that poverty is a driving issue, a really hard issue in our state. And one of the first priorities is to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I don't think that anybody who works full-time should be living in poverty. So, and what I like is raise the minimum wage act, raise the wage act, which of course I support and will champion, not only raises it to $15 an hour, but then indexes it. And that's what we have to do. And that, along with Medicare for All, which I also champion and support, would be a game changer here in New Mexico. Can you imagine that a raise, maybe a raise of double for people who are working on the minimum wage would do? They would spend that money in the local economy and for them to be assured that they have health care. Because it's a human right. I don't think people should have to be employed or have to have money to get health care. And so I think those 2 priorities would make a huge difference in the state at addressing poverty. And then I also believe very strongly that we should pass the 21st Century New Deal for Jobs Act, because that is an act that would provide for infrastructure all around the country. It's $1 trillion over 5 years, but what's great is it's not just roads and bridges, it's also dealing with our digital divide in our rural communities, and it's also helping us with moving our infrastructure to a renewable energy economy, and that's really important for our state. We could export solar and wind if we have the infrastructure to do so. And so that's why I support that as well.
That's actually a question on my list about environmental issues and right now New Mexico's relationship with oil and gas, and it's a very healthy one. And how do we drive the current oil and gas companies who are fracking Chaco Canyon? How do we get Halliburton out of New Mexico, or at least get them to change what they're doing? And what are you going to do to protect sacred sites like Chaco? And
sacred sites are crucial and important, but also we live in a desert. And so one of the things that fracking does, because I've read a lot about this, and I should tell you, I co-founded the Environmental Law Clinic at University of New Mexico, and when I did that, I co-taught in the clinic, and I worked on water issues, both water quantity and water quality issues. And so when I think about fracking, I think about both of those issues we worked on. The quality issue, because they take the water out of our aquifer, out of our surface water, they put chemicals that they won't even tell us what is in it because it's patented, and then they put them in the ground so deep that they promise that it will not percolate up and interfere with the aquifer. That's taking water out of both the aquifer and our surface water that we use many, many times after it comes down as snowfall in the Colorado Rockies. And we simply can't afford to do that. We're in the desert. We have obligations to Texas. So that would affect our water quantity. And then the quality, to put water in the ground that is poisoned with chemicals that we don't even know what they are, I think is absolutely irresponsible. And that's not to mention the other health problems that it could cause based on the construction that they engage in on the surface, and the potential for earthquakes, because they're literally breaking up our subsurface, and that's very scary. So I support actually a ban on fracking.
Do you see a way for New Mexico to move to 100% renewables over a period of time? Or what does that timeline look like?
Absolutely. That's another act that I champion and support, and that is the Off Fossil Fuels Act. What that does is it requires our country to go to 100% renewable energy by 2035. And some people have asked, well, isn't that a long time? And I said, well, maybe New Mexico could do it earlier if we had a cooperative governor. We've had a governor that has done nothing toward this, and we've lost 8 years.
Right, I agree with that. So on that same topic, what is your relationship with the indigenous communities in New Mexico and the sovereign nations here? We still literally have pueblos that don't have running water or electricity, who are living in extreme poverty conditions that are comparable to third world countries. Right here in New Mexico. And what would you be able to do as a congresswoman to help those conditions?
Well, one of the things that I co-founded, or not co-founded, I didn't co-found this, but I hired the first director of the Southwest Indian Law Clinic, and the idea of the clinic was to serve indigenous communities throughout the state. It's the Southwest Indian Law Clinic, and they've even taken cases even beyond. And one of the things that's very important is to respect sovereignty, but also to comply with the treaty obligations that are ancient.
Right.
And our government needs to be held accountable to those treaty obligations. We have an obligation to provide education and health care to the Native communities and indigenous people, and the government has fallen down on those obligations. We also have mismanaged. The U.S. government has mismanaged trust lands, and there needs to be compensation for that mismanagement. Because when you see people, just like you said, living in poverty, living in conditions that, with no water, with no sewage, with no, in some cases, no electricity, that's an outrage. Because, and when you notice that the federal government has mismanaged so much of their property, that needs to be remedied. And so I would work very, very hard on making sure that they're compensated adequately for the treaty violations, and also that their sovereignty is respected. I'm also close to that issue with regard to domestic violence. We need to change the VAWA so it's not just domestic violence that they can prosecute in the tribal courts against non-native people, but it also needs to be sexual assault, because the way tribal land was before was, it was almost either there was no jurisdiction at all against non-native people, or they had to go to federal court, and the federal courts were not good at taking domestic violence and sexual assault cases. And so I think those are other important sovereignty issues that we need to address, and that is by supporting the strengthening of the court system within the tribes and ensuring that they have the jurisdiction to prosecute those cases.
And I appreciate that you led us to that topic, because that goes right into one of my next questions is, the federal government, it has deep prosecution within Native communities. I work for a criminal defense attorney. I work within the community and criminal justice issues. And our federal government repeatedly targets communities of color and the poor. So the first piece of this question is about how the federal government digs in on criminal cases within Native communities, and how and tribes should be empowered to be able to delegate what goes to the federal, what's reported to the feds, that goes federal. But I also see a lot of political mismanagement within that system. Is there some idea that you have of what we can do to address those issues, where Native Americans are being pushed into federal jurisdiction, federal court, federal sentencing, federal prisons, and it's sort of this pick and choose type of situation that happens sometimes, and some of them are low-level offenses. It's people who got into a fight in the middle of the street, and only one side gets prosecuted and dragged into federal court. So how do we deal with those injustices?
Barbara Creel, who is a professor at the law school, and she's a Jemez Pueblo woman, wrote an amazing article about that very topic. And what she talks about is how unfair it is that the tribal courts have such limited jurisdiction at this level, and then the federal government comes in at this level. And so the limited jurisdiction is, it has to be a minor matter for the tribes to step in. So you have criminal justice system where it's either a tribal matter, which is not a serious crime, or it's a federal crime
There's
in
nothing
the
in the
federal
middle.
system, and there's nothing in between. And in the between area is where you can take people and maybe put them through rehabilitation programs. Drug, and another major problem we have with the federal system is we now have private prison systems where there are incentives because they have to pay whether we incarcerate people or not, but we have incentives of incarceration. And so that's the system dealing with tribal communities. And I think that that's a real problem. And so one of the ways is to provide adequate resources so that the tribes get to expand their jurisdiction, so that it's more along the lines, because right now in state courts you have the state courts dealing with all those middle levels, and then you have federal crimes. And sometimes there's overlap, but usually there's a state crime system, and then you have the federal system, and usually they're different crimes.
Right.
And now, one of the things that she wrote about was how Native people are even subject to getting prosecuted in the tribe and then prosecuted again in the federal system. And so that seemed to me, as a constitutional person, a violation of double jeopardy. But because of the way the system is set up, it's not viewed that way. And so those are, I could probably, actually, I love talking with Barbara Creel about those, but you could talk all day because there's so many individual examples of those problems. The one I focused on was domestic violence and sexual assault, but there are many, many, many problems.
Right. And speaking to those issues, I wanted to talk a little bit about the federal sting operation that former U.S. Attorney Damon Martinez executed on people of color here in our community in Albuquerque. What he did was he brought 5 CIs of color, 3 black and 2 brown, and he pointed them literally at my community, from the International District to the Kirk neighborhood, off of Gibson to the South Valley, to our own soul food restaurants and barber shops that I have ties to. And many of my friends and family members got swept up in that. And then they touted this as being a target of the worst, which is a farce because most of those people were living in halfway houses. They were recovering drug addicts. Some of them were living in their cars. They were homeless people. And now those people are in the federal system. And a few of them have decided to fight back, and for having the audacity to demand discovery and exposure about this case. The federal government has pushed for mandatory minimums. On Yusef Casanova, for example, for having the audacity to demand more discovery, they went off of him on habituals. And so now he's facing 20 years to life. This was a 57-year-old homeless man who was living in his car, who made a phone call and handed the CI a phone. He did not possess the drugs. He didn't participate except for to make the phone call and connect the people.
Wow.
And so, to me, this was an extreme situation of targeted racial profiling, targeted policing, and the manufacturing of crime within our own communities. As a congresswoman, what could you do to stop these kind of operations from even coming here? And from even the next step, how do we go after the federal government to even defund these kinds of stings? Those CIs were paid $80,000 a year.
Well, Congress, of course, has the ability to modify the federal criminal laws. One act that I champion is the Marijuana Justice Act. And what that act does is it allows each state to decide whether it's going to legalize marijuana or not. And that's really all Congress can do, because you can't force legalization, or you can't,
Right.
all you can do is do that. And then the other thing that's very important is it expunges federal criminal records for marijuana possession and then the other thing that it does that's very important is it penalizes states who fail to analyze the impact of the enforcement of marijuana laws on people of color. And so that is an example of legislation that can be passed to give guidance to the Justice Department on how they should be pursuing federal crimes. And I think that that act is, I think, a model for other kinds of acts we can look at to really stop this school-to-prison pipeline that sometimes, well, I shouldn't say sometimes, that often captures communities of color. And so looking at the criminal laws and revising them, I also think that the sentencing guidelines and the way they've been applied needs to be really addressed dramatically. They're exactly what you say. They've had a disproportionate impact on people of color, and I think that we should pass legislation like the Marijuana Justice Act in other kinds of areas that have had a disproportionate impact on people of color. It's a travesty.
So, you know, we spend all these millions of dollars on these federal sting operations that, you know, but we can't afford healthcare or education, they tell us, right? So do you feel like besides like these kinds of acts that there's some other way to start looking at the money that the DEA and ATF are spending on manufacturing crime?
You know, I think that's an excellent idea, because I really think that it's a matter of priorities in all of the spending that the government takes on. When you look at our spending, our military spending, $700 billion a year. And while of course it's important to keep ourselves safe, it's important to use the labs to the best of our abilities, all of that is very important. But I don't know if you saw the television program a few weeks ago that talked about the building of a methane gas station in the middle of nowhere, in the Middle East, that nobody's using, that originally was supposed to cost a couple of $1 million, ended up costing $20 million. Those are the kinds of things that I would review very, very carefully. And an example is the money that has been spent by the Justice Department to see what exactly is it being spent on, how effective is it, and does it have this disproportionate impact that you've been talking about? And that is a power that Congress has.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that this idea of arresting people for drug crimes when our own government is manufacturing drugs and selling them back into the community is, it's a very dangerous hypocrisy. You know, the feds here in Albuquerque lost 5 pounds of meth on the streets just 8 months ago. What did 5 pounds of meth do to our community? We don't know, right? But the damage is there, and that was just the one that got publicized. You know, how many more of these things are happening on a regular basis? I can tell you that from the 90s, the feds have been in my neighborhoods always, for decades, manufacturing crime in my community. And so, you know, that's an issue that's really, really important to us, because our community feels like it's under attack by our own government.
Well, that, I think, is a failure of the so-called war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as you point out, the war on drugs often looks to our communities like a war on our communities rather than targeting the drugs. I think there are so many other ways to deal with addiction problems. We don't have enough behavioral health funding here in the state. As you know, our governor devastated our behavioral problem, the health coverage, the safety net that had taken decades to build. And so, yes, I see so many alternative ways of addressing particularly drug problems. Yes, I agree. The war on drugs has been a war on our people, and we need to really change the focus to addressing the root causes. A lot of the root causes for addiction have to do with poverty, with hopelessness, with behavioral health issues. And so if we could address the root causes, that would be better for our society than
finally treating it as the medical issue that it is.
Yes, absolutely.
So, and in connection with that, the other piece that happens is militarized police equipment, making it into our streets and into our local communities. You know, APD shouldn't own a tank, I don't think. Like, what do they possibly need a tank for? Are they at war with the community? And to me, that's what that signals. And so most of this kind of militarized police equipment comes from the federal government. It comes from the feds down to these police agencies. We have really, really small counties here in New Mexico who own militarized police equipment. What can we do to stop that flow from happening or address those costs? I mean, obviously that money could be used for something different.
I actually think, I think it's an escalation of gun, because gun manufacturers are about making money, and so who they sell to doesn't matter to them as long as they're making money. That's why I pledge not to take any money from the NRA, because the fact that there are assault weapons on the streets means that the police feel insecure, so for whatever reason they think that they need a tank. And I don't understand why we need assault weapons or why we haven't banned bump stocks, that kind of dangerous weapons that our police then feel that they have to respond with a militarization, right? Because we've militarized our society in a sense, right, by having all of these guns. And so I think, as I said, I pledge not to take any money from the NRA, any money from fossil fuels industries, any money from corporate PACs, and I did that because I want the community to know that I represent the community and not special interests, because I find it disgusting to look at the members of Congress, see the money they've taken the NRA, and then see their votes. So, I mean, you talk about the flow. I think we need to stop it at the very beginning. One of the things we can do is there is a law, and this is to me unbelievable, but there is a law that actually protects gun manufacturers from liability for the way their guns are used. And I think that we need to reverse that law, because most manufacturers of dangerous, or manufacturers who manufacture dangerous products, have strict liability imposed on them. And here, gun manufacturers are protected from liability. And so that, I think, is something that we can do as well. And maybe gun manufacturers would be more responsible in the guns that they create, how they're used, and who they sell to,
Well,
including...
There's even another layer of economics to that stream, is the insurance companies. There's actual insurance companies out here where if I am a gun owner, I'm an NRA person, I can buy insurance that will pay for all of my legal costs if I shoot somebody dead in the street. You know, this I think leads to some of the vigilantism that happens with some emboldened people. You know, we've seen the degree of racism. I'm spokesperson for Justice for Jaquise Lewis. He's Albuquerque's Trayvon Martin. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's 17 years old, shot in the back in Albuquerque's skate park.